A huge part of the jazz and bebop sound comes from using chromatic notes, but only if you do it the right way. Instead of just focusing on notes, you want to think in phrases. And in this video, I'll show you simple, practical phrases that you can use right away to get that classic jazz sound that you hear from people like George Benson or Joe Pass. Your solos won't really sound like jazz if you don't have phrases like these in your vocabulary. What makes bebop so amazing is that it's playful and rhythmic, starting and stopping in unpredictable places. Bebop is full of small, dissonant melodies, which is exactly what chromatic phrases are. If you stick around, I'll show you the right way to use these essential bebop techniques. Let's start with the most important one. The fact that this next exercise is not Barry Harris' chromatic scale may cause a small riot in the comment section, but this very simple exercise is used by everyone, including Barry Harris if you check out his solos, and we'll get to his scale in a bit. This incredibly simple exercise is triad-based, straightforward, and maybe even a little bit boring, but it's unbelievably powerful. Let's start with a basic C major triad. And you will be able to turn this into a lick like this. At first glance it might seem complicated, but it's all coming from this ascending exercise, which adds an enclosure around each note in the triad, a scale note above each chord tone and a chromatic note below. Notice how the arpeggio moves up while each chromatic enclosure moves down, and that contrast is a part of what makes it sound great and makes it instant bebop. For the descending version, it works the same way, opposite directions. Arpeggio moves down, then the enclosure moves up. This is incredibly simple, but the concept is used everywhere in bebop, not only on triads or arpeggios. For example, here's how it works when you expand it to a C major 7 arpeggio with some added scale notes. Now that you have this concept for triads, I think it makes sense to explore Barry Harris' chromatic scale, and then we can add a bit of rhythm to the mix as well. Okay, editing Jens here. So every time I make a video like this, then I always have these comments where it's like, I don't like enclosures, they're not musical, and I only use Barry Harris' chromatic scale. Now, I know that Barry Harris doesn't talk about enclosures using that word, but that doesn't mean that they're not a part of what he plays and what he teaches. If you take a look at his 5-4-3-2 phrases, so that would be these, then you'll realize that actually his fourth phrase is a chromatic enclosure. You have this, where of course is a chromatic enclosure. He uses that one really a lot. Actually, it's not the only one he uses, but that one he uses very often. If you take a look at his solo on I Remember April, you have this phrase in the bridge. So there are chromatic enclosures everywhere, both in his teaching and also in his playing. And I know they're more difficult to use because they change direction, they're just more complicated, but they're definitely worth it. The weird thing about Barry Harris' chromatic scale is that the exceptions are the ones that I love and use the most. Strictly speaking, they're not chromatic at all, but they sound fantastic. And Barry's system for chromatic notes is straightforward and flexible. So let's just start with a C major scale. Here's how it works step by step. When there is a half step between two notes, so from C to D, then you simply add that chromatic passing note, so C sharp. Now when there's no half step, so let's take E and F, then you use the scale note above, so in this case that's a G. So for the C major scale, well, we can add the C sharp between C and D, and then a D sharp between D and E. Between E and F, I'm using the G, as I just showed you, so. And then of course I can add half steps, so F up to G, up to A, up to B, and then between B and C, I'm using the D. That gives you the following chromatic scale. The truly interesting parts are of course the spots where there isn't a natural half step. And while I've suggested using the scale note above, then Barry often emphasized that you can use any note as a half step. And that's why in the descending version, I actually tend to stick with the same choice, simply because I think that sounds better. But theory aside, what really matters is how this sounds in action. So here's a bebop inspired lick that kicks off with a few Barry Harris half steps and also includes an enclosure. And here's another line, still rooted in a C major 7 arpeggio, but with a few more half steps in there. Notice how both examples use groups of half steps, which are incredibly easy to insert and combine with other building blocks like arpeggios and scale runs. And these phrases just naturally fall into place in bebop vocabulary. Let's take this a step further by adding the first rhythmic variation and cover something that is not a system. The first rhythmic variation you'll want to explore is one you've probably heard before, an arpeggio with a chromatic leading note. This technique isn't limited to a single chord. You can apply it to any 7th chord arpeggio, making it a very flexible tool in your jazz vocabulary. It's also incredibly useful to practice this concept through the scale, something that I of course also learned from Barry Harris. You'll hear arpeggios played this way all over jazz. It's a fantastic way to vary the rhythm, and if you take a closer look, you'll see that I'm reusing one of the key building blocks from example 9. This time it's just an octave lower. Let's take it a bit further by adding the 2 rhythmic chromatic phrases that I mentioned. This one is very close to a Barry Harris line as well. In bebop, not all structures sound that great as triplets, but besides the arpeggios that you already heard, this chromatic enclosure sounds really great. And you can put this to use in a line like this. This is not strictly a system, but a way to take this enclosure through the scale could be something like this. And this exercise is of course a bit long, but remember that you can download a free PDF of all the examples on my website. And using one of the other enclosures, you can create a line like this. This next chromatic phrase also uses triplets, and it isn't really an enclosure, but it's a very nice concept to add to your solos. This is based on connecting chord tones in an arpeggio, and it's something that I learned from saxophone player John Rocco while I was studying at the conservatory. Now I hear it used once in a while, but I've never heard a lesson about it, which is a little bit of pity. Now if you start with a C major 7 arpeggio, you can make phrases that connect the chord tones. So if you take the first 2 ones, so from C to E, that's a major 3rd. And here I'm playing the C and then just half steps below the E, so D, D sharp, E. Now the next 2 notes in the chord would be E and G. Here I connect with just all half steps. Then moving up further we get from G to A, that's another major 3rd, so same thing as we started with. And I also added the 9th just to show you how that works, because that's of course another minor 3rd, and then we have all half steps. That gives you this. And this works for any 7th chord that's a stack of 3rds, so it pretty much works on all chords. And for a C major 7, you can turn it into a line like this. Or you can use the connection between the G and the B to lead into a descending C major 7 arpeggio. A great resource that I only touched on shortly in this video is of course Barry Harris' chromatic scale, a concept that you can use to create a lot of beautiful bebop lines. And you want to dig into that because it will also give you some other building blocks that are a huge part of the jazz and bebop sound. Check out this video so you don't spend all your time just playing the right notes, but also learn how to make them sound right. Learn jazz, make music.